would say good morning, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Hello, hello, welcome, welcome.
So, interesting topic this evening.
I hope so. Yeah, like I said, I had been wanting to have a dear friend, and I'll kind of tell how Scott suckered Scott into this in a little bit. Yeah, and I think it's going to be. I've been wanting to do this for a while. It's an important topic. So,
I'll be honest, I didn't even see the email. What is the topic?
hopefully, it won't scare you off. No.
TBI.
TBI, traumatic
TBI.
brain injury.
Oh, TBI. Got it, yeah.
Hey, but look, I can make any subject fun. All right, look. If I can take 6 students in the middle of summer in Alabama at 100 degrees and make them all smile, we can make traumatic brain injury a fun subject. So
It's really an interesting subject. I'm trying to get a timeline. About a number of years ago, when I was a RAM at the Harley shop, I had a young woman come into the shop, and very lovely person, seemed totally good to go. And she came in and said, I need someone to teach me how to ride a motorcycle. She said she had some kind of a brain trauma. And apparently she had part of her brain actually removed. And the doctors had told her there were a number of things that she would not be able to do, like skiing, riding a motorcycle, whatever. And she said, I heard you're a good instructor, and so I'd like to see, can you help me? And so we began this interesting relationship. She had bought a Ninja 250 and already owned a motorcycle. And so I was honest with her and said, I'm not sure I can help you, but my belief is the brain is a very interesting organ, and given the opportunity, it will rewire itself to accomplish something that you commit to. And so we started a journey that lasted, I'm going to say 18 months, and one step at a time. It was slow going, but the end result is this person took a BRC and passed and was apparently able to ride a motorcycle. So to me, the human brain is amazing.
yep, I do a lot of neuroplasticity work and a lot of understanding with that. So we have some people slowly coming in, and we won't go keep, we'll take about 1 more minute and then we'll start. I'm going to post the link onto our Facebook page real quick and just let everybody know, hey, join in. And
Murray, if you don't mind me asking, in a non-brain injured situation, how long would you typically work with someone to accomplish that goal?
Okay, so I guess I would ask, what's the concept? I have had students who have had an issue with motor skills development, and I've done some training outside of class, some remedial training specific to students, and it's varied every time. My take is I'll help anybody I can possibly help. But it's really hard to quantify how much time.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, when we do remedial stuff, it's more immediate. It's around a class, before, after, during, breaks, that kind of thing. I'm assuming you're talking about situations that would be outside of those parameters. And so, that's really hard to quantify. It's really so individual.
Mhm.
Some of it's brain-based, some of it's fear-based, some of it's skill-based. Yeah, you really have to assess the situation and apply what you know about learning styles inventory and adult learning and individual learning and try to, and I'm by no means an expert. I go on intuition a lot and I go on the curriculum, but it seems like there's a lot of opportunities out there if we just choose to see them.
Well, thank you for that. So yeah, so hopefully a little bit, what do we connect in tonight? So welcome everyone. As you can tell, my name is Belinda, not Dawn. So if you are new to Tribe Talks, please let me know. And I'm not sure when our fearless leader will be back, but he has kind of tagged some of us in to talk about different subjects and to bring in a great discussion. And tonight I have brought my buddy Scott from the Alabama Traumatic Brain Injury. Am I correct in saying that, Scott?
I've never heard of that organization, but I'll go with it right now.
I don't know, but yeah. So Scott is, so the way I got in touch with Scott was that a fellow therapist of mine, friend and colleague, dear friend, she works for the same place that Scott works for. And I always am asking her questions, right? Like about what does that look like to do counseling with somebody that has a TBI? What does that look like? Do you guys do education? Can you please tell someone to come and talk to us about the importance, not only of, like we all know the importance of helmet use, but what are those long-term things that we need to pay attention to? What are the different things when we want to have the discussion of TBI? And then, and so I bravely told Don I would do one. And then he sends me this form and I'm like, oh gosh, what did I get myself into? And so hopefully you guys had a chance to watch the videos. I will honestly completely admit I have been on the road for the last 7 days on my motorcycle going up north. I've traveled 2,000 miles north to a convention. I'm going to actually kind of pass it off to Scott. We will have discussions just like we've done. If you're new to Tribe Talks, one of the things we do is we will break off into groups throughout the night. We break off into little subgroups like our breakout rooms and just kind of have some discussion. So Scott, I made you co-host. And so if you just want to kind of introduce yourself and what it is that you want to kind of bring to this topic tonight.
I am happy to do so. I am going to share my screen briefly. I will promise you what I have been told. First off, I'll just let Belinda know the Alabama Traumatic Brain Injury is also known as the Alabama Head Injury Foundation. That's the title I went with today. Sometimes I do the Alabama Traumatic Brain Injury. So I'll go with that one too, Belinda. So we'll go both ways.
Okay.
It makes me feel a little bit better that some of you didn't watch the videos and that someone didn't even look at the newsletter to know what the speaker was, because maybe that lowers expectations a tiny bit, because I do feel some pressure with this. But what I've been told, and I hope this is what you guys were expecting from me as well, is I have very few slides because I really would rather spend as much time as possible answering questions and chasing the rabbits that you want to chase about this topic. This is a very broad topic. It can go in any number of directions. But I guess, to kind of feed off of what Belinda said, I will start off with a basic introduction in terms of who am I. As Belinda said, my name is Scott Powell. I am the executive director of the Alabama Head Injury Foundation. I've been with this agency now for 9+ years. And before that, I guess I should also state, because some of you have after your name where you are, I am in the metropolis of Hoover, Alabama. I am an Alabama native. I have lived in Chicago for some time period as well, but most of my life has been here in Alabama. I'm currently in Hoover, which is where my organization is headquartered. I am a proud graduate of the University of Alabama. Some of you that are not from this state may have heard of our football team, which tends to do quite well in sports. And then sadly, I'm also a graduate of Northwestern University, whose football program is also in the news right now, but not for the same reasons that Alabama's football program is, as our head coach was just fired for hazing students. And if any of you have been reading about that, it is a very disturbing story. Belinda, you have a quizzical look, which makes me think you have not kept up with that story. If you want some entertainment tonight, read the hazing accusations against Northwestern University's football program. It is a fascinating and frightening read. But with the Head Injury Foundation, I'm aging myself here, but some of you may be old enough to remember Cy Sperling and the Hair Club for Men. As it turns out, I am not just the executive director of the Alabama Head Injury Foundation. I could be a client because I myself am a traumatic brain injury survivor. I had an ATV accident when I was 9 years of age where I lost consciousness. Was riding down in rural farmland in South Alabama, was not wearing a helmet, hit a sewage pipe and flew into the air over the front of the ATV, landed on hard ground, lost consciousness, and do not remember a lot of the details surrounding that event. Most of it was put together by what people told me about it. So that was my TBI story. Thankfully, I don't know if everyone would agree, but I don't think it's affected me cognitively long term. So that's probably a plus for me in that regard. But that's sort of, I guess, an overall basic piece of who I am and why I'm talking to you. I also will share some things that I am not, just so you know. I am not a doctor. I am not a healthcare provider. But I have spent a lot of time in training and education and firsthand experience working with people that are living with traumatic brain injuries, traumatic spinal cord injuries, and understand this population extremely well. So, I hope that will lead to some questions and some discussion as we go through. But I wanted to start off kind of big picture when we talk about brain injury in general. Traumatic brain injury is just one piece of really a category of different ways that the brain can be injured. I appreciate Murray's introduction and story, because I think that him talking about what a fascinating organ the brain is was a great segue into anything that I would talk about in terms of the brain is fascinating, but there are a lot of different ways that the brain can be injured. Starting on the far left-hand side, you've got infections of the brain. The infection can be somewhere else. It can be in the brain, spread to the brain, but obviously has an impact on the brain's function. But that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about the idea of traumatic brain injury. You also obviously have brain tumors that can actually originate, with cancer originating in the brain as a brain tumor, or a non-cancerous brain tumor, or a tumor that originates in another part of the body and metastasizes to the brain. On the right-hand side, you have anoxic brain injury, which is lack of oxygen to the brain. The most common example of that, typically being drowning situations or other type situations where someone loses oxygen flow to the brain, and then vascular conditions, which would also take into account all of your strokes. Strokes have very similar outcomes to traumatic brain injuries, but they are not a traumatic brain injury because it's due to a vascular situation within the head. And so that leaves us with just the traumatic brain injury piece here, which by our definition is a specific type of an acquired brain injury caused by a blow or jolt to the head or a penetrating head injury that in some way disrupts the function of the brain. So there are a lot of different ways it can happen. It can be a blunt impact where something is literally striking your head, whether it be a wall or an object, something falling on you, a tree falling on you, any number of things that could happen where you're going to have something external to your head striking your head, causing the brain injury. You have penetrating injuries where you actually, this could be everything from the most common causes, sadly, which would be bullets going into the skull and an act of violence. It also could be pieces of metal that jam into the brain, anything like that. You've got blast waves, which typically you would see with an explosive device, in particular, a lot of the IEDs that happened in the Middle East to our soldiers. And then probably the one that's got the most relevance to us would be the accelerating, decelerating force, where you actually have a situation where the head itself is moving fast enough that is what causes the brain injury itself. And we'll talk a little bit more about that before we break into some discussion or some Q&A time as well. So the brain, in a lot of ways, the analogy that you typically hear about it is sort of like if you took like a Jello mold and suspended it in water inside the skull. So it is spongy, it is soft, and it is floating within the skull, even though it is loosely attached to the skull. So anytime that you have a traumatic twist of the head, striking of the head, or rapid acceleration and deceleration of the head, you're introducing the opportunity for a brain injury to occur. And I think one of the things that people probably don't think about a lot with brain injuries is, and it's got some fancy terminology for it, but it's really, it's a simpler concept to understand. You have what's called the coup and the contra coup impact. And if you think about being rear-ended, or even having someone come up and push you violently from behind, the first interaction that you're going to have is actually going to be the contra coup, where your body's moving forward, but because your brain is floating, it actually doesn't keep up with the rest of the body, and it slams into the back of the skull, which causes the initial brain injury in any sort of an impact situation. Then after that happens, the entire body moves forward, the brain starts to catch up and moves forward, and then when your body stops moving, you have a second impact where the brain hits the front of the skull, and you actually have brain damage that is occurring on both ends of the brain because of the way that it's floating within the skull. And so that's where the whole concept behind what a brain injury looks like and how it operates. And when you look at the different areas of the brain and that are affected, a lot of times you'll have people say, I don't understand why this is affecting someone because they were hit in the back of their head, but all of the symptoms of their brain injury are things associated with the frontal lobe. And the reason why is because wherever you're hit, you're typically going to have damage occurring on opposite ends of the brain. This is true for a side collision as well, that if you're hit in the side, you very easily could end up having more damage on this side than on the impact side because of the way the brain moves within the head. So with that, I'm going to initially, we're not going to go into breakout rooms yet, Belinda, but I did want to pause and just see if anyone has any initial questions about just what I'm even talking about when I talk about brain injury as a whole.
Yeah, guys, this is open forum. Ask questions, please.
I guess I won't ask a question, but I'll just say an experience is my maintenance guy just quit via text today. He was blown up 3 times in Iraq and has emotional issues, probably not only from the war, but also traumatic brain injuries. You know, he's been at the VA a couple of times in the last few weeks and almost gave up on life and decided that he was going to seek treatment instead, but definitely has experienced some trauma to his body and his brain, certainly, you know, by being blown up. So, yep.
Thank you, Pat. Jesse? I see that you're in Vermont. Are you guys okay?
Yeah, we're good. We're right by the
quick.
Connecticut River. It's central Vermont that really got nailed, just west of us. But yeah, we're good.
All right, good. So make sure.
Yeah, we just drove through there today because I drove up to Burlington to deliver tomatoes, and it's pretty ugly in a lot of places. Montpelier was pretty hard hit. So, yep.
Thank you.
So I have a quick question. I guess the experiences with people that I know who've had TBIs, it often doesn't manifest right away, like right after the initial injury. Is that really relevant to this discussion?
I think it absolutely is, because I think a lot of times, you know, and a lot of that comes down to a couple of different factors. If you've had something that happened that was traumatic enough to cause a traumatic brain injury, it oftentimes also involves physical injuries that need to heal. And so much of the focus is on what's going on with that. And so you have a lot of situations where someone's in an ICU and other type of situations, but it's not until they really come out, go through rehab, and then you establish a new baseline where they are, that you really start to see some of the true cognitive impact of what's going on. I think that happens in memory issues. It happens in mild personality changes. It happens in behavior issues, filter issues, emotional regulation issues. All of those pieces are things that you may not see within even sometimes the first 3 to 6 months following the injury before you really start to realize what's going on. And that is a common occurrence with a brain injury. because as the brain is going through its healing process, it can mask some things. There are other things that are probably ignored, and it's not until you get further along that you realize that some of the situations that are out there have actually become exacerbated after time and don't seem to be healing, but actually seem to be getting worse or certainly not improving over time. So we do see that a lot.
Okay.
What is your experience with traumatic brain injury, if you don't mind me asking?
My brother in 2013 was working on a surveying crew, and he was hit by a texting driver. Long story about the scenario itself, but she plowed through a work site and hit him. So he apparently stood up right away when it happened, but by the time they got him to the ER, he was gone. Well, not really gone, because a side story, my idiot niece refused to sign a DNR, but he was left in a persistent vegetative state on a ventilator in a nursing home for 3 years just because of that. But they did try all these life-saving things when it happened in surgery, and what can we do to reduce the swelling? So they call it a TBI, but he, with that state, they don't know if they're conscious at all, but they know he wasn't brain dead. So so I know that there's a gamut of stuff, and I have another friend who was on a ship that was hit by a bomb in the big one, Gulf War of 91, and his experience seems to be getting more challenging, right, in terms of behavior and ability to focus, and that was 30 years ago. So yeah.
Thanks, Scott. We're going to talk about that a little bit, right? Like how that long term kind of
Yes.
pays into that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you sharing both of those. And I'm so sorry to hear about your brother with that. One of the things that we do as an organization, the Alabama Head Injury Foundation, is a point of advocacy. And one of the things that we finally were able to get passed this year in our recent legislative session was a texting and driving law. We had been very resistant to it for a long time. Georgia had one of the first, and now most states have some sort of texting and driving law because it is such a common occurrence of people not paying attention while they're driving. There's so many more distractions now, and it is a huge cause of why traumatic brain injuries are occurring.
I thought it was a federal law already. I thought it was at the federal level.
There is no federal law guiding texting and driving regulations at all. They're all done on an individual state level through what law enforcement can enforce.
Interesting. Yep. Okay, thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm. Similarly, it took Alabama a long time to get laws passed to about people riding in the back of pickup trucks, which was another cause that seemed very easy to overcome, to say that it's probably not the best idea to ride in the back of vehicles on the interstate. It takes Alabama a long time to do some things. I'm sure Belinda could speak to that too.
Yeah, I think here in Alabama, I'm not here now, but in Alabama, I don't think our motorcycle laws have changed since probably the 70s on many things. We are still the only state, I think, that you don't have to take a driving test. You just take 25 question test and get a motorcycle license, and and be 14. And so so we still have pretty antiquated motorcycle things, and so which is one reason why I said I'm fascinated by this, is because we have a lot of weird laws, and so
So and I think that I will go through one more thing, and then if we want to, we can actually have our first discussion if we want to, Belinda. But I did want to provide a tiny bit of fun for you guys, and thought that we would do a quick game of Family Feud of the most common causes of traumatic brain injury. So I would like to entertain your guesses, and I will mark on the board if you are correct and have found one of the top 8 causes of traumatic brain injury. So who would like to venture a guess?
Motorcycle accident?
They do not track motorcycle accidents separately from overall motor vehicle accidents. I will give you credit for that with the number 3 answer of motor vehicles and motorcycles altogether, which make up 14% of all traumatic brain injuries.
Slips and falls.
Slips and falls. from Mount Vernon, Washington. And congratulations, sir, you have found the number one answer.
Good job, John. Good job.
What do I win? What do I win?
The ability to shame everyone else on the call because you came up with the number one answer and they did not.
John always has the best answers, sir.
Is this like the percentage? Is that like 40? Is the 40% of TBIs are from falls?
It is indeed.
Does it take into account all the military members from explosions with the number of TBIs that are being tracked with the military?
It obviously can only take those that are reported. But in that regard, it would take that into account.
So is that one of the answers? Is military or
I
combat?
would say explosions and stuff like that from the military, because so many of the guys, and that number is constantly being evaluated. Like I'm being evaluated for a possible TBI that occurred in 05 with the VA right now.
I'm going to count that because in most cases, even though the object in this case may actually be waves that can cause that, it all comes together in being struck by an object.
Mine struck, yeah. I was just
Yeah.
thinking of the number of guys who, with explosions and everything else from earlier on in the war, that number's got to be massive if they're taking into account those being evaluated today.
The reason that it gets diluted by falls as well, and you have to think about that, is the number of seniors. Even in nursing home type situations, falls, there's so many traumatic brain injuries and they don't get recognized as much because they typically are masked by the possibility of it being progressive dementia, Alzheimer's, something like that. And the treatment's not really any different because if they're already in a facility that tries to minimize fall risk and tries to provide balance issues and everything else, they're just going to go along the same piece. But the senior population, the number of falls really tilts that as the number one answer.
So I think I saw Rick and Ray unmute themselves. Do y'all have an answer? Okay, so we've got a domestic violence.
So someone just guessed domestic violence. That is the number 5 cause.
Sports.
Sports. You know, it gets all of the attention, but it only comes in at number 6.
I'll take it.
Yeah.
It's still on the board though. That's right. Yeah. So you know, hey, you get credit.
Bicycles.
Ooh. Most of your bicycles, and it's a real fine line because I almost gave you credit for a different answer, but bicycles would be included within the falls category because of the nature of the injury, because you are falling off the bicycle. If you were struck by a car and you were on a bicycle, then that would be a motor vehicle piece. So that's how they categorize these. So it gets a little tricky in terms of what that looks like. But I'm not going to count that as a separate one.
Skateboarding? Is that considered as part of it?
Again, would all come under the broader heading of falls. Some of you might remember how I sustained mine.
How about swimming or drowning?
In that case, swimming or drowning would be an anoxic brain injury, so it would not be included in the category of traumatic brain injury, even though it certainly is a common cause of anoxic brain injury. Partial drowning absolutely would be.
Struck object, not struck by object, but struck object. Like you hit something else.
I'm still.
And remember, this is called Tribe Talk, but we also are kind of happy hour. So some of us may be happy to the answer. So
I will release you from this and let you just see the remaining answers.
I'm going to say drunk. Yeah, possibility of drunkenness. I don't know. Yeah.
We did get domestic violence, but skipped its sister companion of violence. So obviously there are numerous acts of violence that fall outside of the domestic violence piece, but both of them are tracked separately, which I think is important, that they are both tracked separately, because it does represent 2 very real forms of traumatic brain injury, and both that need to be dealt with in different ways. Then we have ATV accidents, followed by the frustrating generic other, which always has to be a part of any list of what makes that up. I showed this for a couple of reasons, because and when you said sports, I pointed out how far down it was because it's eternally frustrating for me as I look at this, because I look at this list first off, and then I think this doesn't necessarily match the reason that people come to my organization for services. We actually have motor vehicle accidents and motorcycle accidents as our #1 cause of people becoming our clients. And the reason that it's #3 on this list and #1 on our list is because brain injuries from motor vehicle accidents, motorcycle accidents tend to be more severe. And so they tend to need more long-term supports. And sports-related concussions are probably the best identified, the least severe, and the most likely to have a positive outcome of all the types of traumatic brain injury that there are. But every time I do a television interview during Brain Injury Awareness Month, every time I talk to anyone from United Way, every time I'm doing a fundraising pitch, the first question they ask me is about sports-related concussions. And I can't get away from the topic because it's what accesses everyone's thoughts when they think about traumatic brain injury is concussions. And obviously, you know, and it's a good opportunity sometimes to get the word out, but even during last football season with Tua Tagovailoa, former Alabama quarterback with the Dolphins, seeing what was happening with the multiple concussions that he had, that's how I got invited to come on TV and talk about things. And when I tried to pivot the conversation to say, yes, we should put attention on sports-related concussions, but there are so many other areas where we're not even doing a great job of diagnosing what's going on. It's underreported within the military. It's underreported within our senior population. We are not doing anything to address the traumatic brain injuries from violence that happen across the country, but everyone focuses on the sports side of things. So I hear that a lot. So it doesn't surprise me. That's why I like to show this. It's just kind of to bring attention to a lot of the different ways that brain injuries can occur. So,
Okay, so I have a real quick question before we step into our discussion. Our first, by the way, while you're doing that, I need to make my breakout rooms. Why are ATVs and motorcycles are separate? Why are motorcycles underneath motor vehicles and ATV is separate?
the only explanation that I have found for that, because I was afraid someone was going to ask me that question, is because ATVs, typically those accidents are not on roads. And so they based it on if the accident was on a road or not on a road. And I do imagine that there are probably plenty of off-road vehicles for cars and for motorcycles where there's still accidents that occur. But because ATVs are typically used in off-roading type situations, that's why they track that one separately. And you could go online and type in causes of TBI and find 84 pie charts that break them up all a little bit differently, but this is a composite that I've put together really over the past 3 years of trying to find the best data that I can, but you're never going to get. Every state doesn't even track them the same. When they put them into a registry, there's no national registry for traumatic brain injury that requires you to use certain reporting of what the cause of injury was. So it's a lot of trying to piece together information that doesn't always blend and try and come up with the best example that you can. It's a good question.
Nice.
And I probably could put ATVs with motor vehicles and that would push it into the #2 slot, or pull motorcycles out and see what happens if it was just cars. But I've not been able to find that data to isolate it to motorcycles versus motor vehicles with 4-wheel cars. I've not been able to find that data anywhere.
So do you have our first discussion? I've got a couple more people coming in. I think Chuck's been trying to come in. So, or which way would you like to go now?
The first question, and because I wasn't, you talked about the form that Don sent out. I wasn't 100% sure about that. So the lead-in questions, I'm guessing, were what was designed to be discussed in the breakout rooms.
Yes, I'm going to copy those into the chat right now.
So, so the first one that seems to apply to what we talked about so far is really just kind of more talking about what happens inside the skull when a brain injury occurs, and that could probably go into the causes as well, because we don't spend a lot of. So we could certainly talk deeper into causes and what happens initially to the brain when a brain injury occurs.
All right. So, what was the first question that I have in here? It says, how can I recognize the potential long-term effects of a previous brain injury?
And I would like to hold that because we haven't gotten to that in the discussion. So I think the second one makes more sense about what exactly happens inside the skull when the brain injury occurs. And we could pivot off of that also to talk about how that relates to the different causes. How the cause may impact what's happening inside the brain.
So how do you want to do it with the discussion lead in? How do you want to do that?
How is that typically done? Because that is not something I'm familiar with.
Yeah, so what we do is we usually put a discussion question and then we break them into breakout rooms. Oh,
Mhm.
Elizabeth, I hate to see her leave. But we break them into breakout rooms and everybody has a discussion about it, maybe some ideas, and then everybody reports back. One person reports back from kind of what they were discussing. And so I know some people were
So
here.
do we think that standalone second question of how do you think the type of, the cause of injury can impact what's happening inside the brain when a brain injury occurs? Is that coherent enough to make sense for a topic to discuss?
Well, I don't know. Let's throw it out to the floor and tell me,
Okay.
what do you guys, from the first part that Scott talked about, what do you feel would be the best way to discuss? Or do you, like I said, I know it was kind of an odd way to do that. So,
Our normal breakout groups, we have some knowledge about it. I have no idea how to answer those questions. I thought this was going to be more educational so we could take and use it back during our, classroom part of, we're doing, still doing the 3, 5, and 10. So I was hoping to be able to have something that I could encourage people to use helmets, a tidbit of information or a story or something like that. That's what I was hoping to get from this Tribe Talk.
well,
As
we can pivot a little if you'd like. And, but like I said, I definitely am I'm a big fan of discussion because, I know many of us, it is a Wednesday and at night and, but we also, I'm not a fan. And like I said, this is me being the host tonight. I'm not a fan of talking to, and we should not, none of us should be really, right? So I want to be able to make sure there's plenty of discussion. So, but we also understand that this is your room. This is your discussion also. And we want this to be as interactive as possible with the education aspect of it. So trust me, I've been a little stumped on too, how to go about this, because I do know that I want this to be an education thing, because I want to know more. Like I said, that's one reason why I picked, pun intended, I picked Scott's brain so much for almost 2 hours when we talked about it. And so maybe we could go that route, Scott. And if you want to do a little bit more extended Q&A experience and that kind of thing. How does that sound?
I'm happy to go down that road and take questions. So certainly I can move forward. So sounds
so move forward a little bit. Yeah, and then we'll go forward.
Okay. I will ask that you humor me in terms of the fact that please don't ever feel like that you need to wait until like a question slide or something like that to ask a question, because I would much rather, again, answer questions as we come across things. So let me know if we come across things. So I did mention, that a lot of this, in terms of the discussion, in terms of where that goes, so much of what goes on with the brain injury and the cause of the injury ties back to how severe it actually was. Thankfully, with all the brain injuries that occur, the CDC has estimates in terms of the number of brain injuries that occur across the US every year. It is shocking how that number continues to change, and it has never gone down. The CDC started tracking traumatic brain injuries in 1984. There's never been a year where the number of traumatic brain injuries in the subsequent year was actually less than what it was in the prior year. It has always gone up every year. So it is a problem that is not going away. It's a problem that is very real. Some of that absolutely could be due to the fact that we're doing a better job of identifying what a brain injury is. A lot of you probably grew up in a generation like I did, where if you hit your head and were dizzy, maybe even nauseated to the point where you felt like you needed to throw up, we used a phrase for it and said that you got your bell rung. And as long as you could pull it back together and maybe answer a couple of quick questions, if you were playing in a game, you were back on the field. If you were working a job, you were going back to work, there was no time to give your brain time to recover, because we didn't know what we were dealing with. We didn't use phrases like concussions very often. We certainly didn't use traumatic brain injury. I had not heard that term, honestly, until probably about the early 2000s, that I remember ever hearing that phrase for the first time, of a traumatic brain injury and what that even meant. So within the whole population of brain injuries that occur, about 80% of them are mild, 13% are moderate, and 7% are severe. If you're in the mild category, there's a very good likelihood, if you have sustained a mild traumatic brain injury, that if you give yourself the appropriate time to recover, rest, and that you don't push yourself to try and get back to doing whatever it is you want to do too quickly, that you're probably going to have a complete recovery and not have any lasting ramifications, at least early on, as a result of your brain injury. They put together, some metrics to figure out what actually quantifies these dividing lines, but it does get a little bit gray in between them. Obviously, if you've lost consciousness, and you've lost consciousness for 29 minutes, then it could be qualified as mild. But if you're that close to the threshold, there's a good chance it probably is a moderate. So you should never really hang your hat on those exact numbers, but where you fall within the field of all of this. But obviously, you can look at the characteristics of severe and know that if you are unconscious for longer than a week, and that if you have amnesia of not being able to remember the events of your accident for at least a week out, you still haven't regained any memory of how your accident occurred, you are talking about a severe brain injury that is probably going to have some lasting long-term impact on your life. At that point in time, you're probably not talking about when will I be fully recovered. You're probably talking about when will I get to my plateau where I'm probably going to establish my new normal. And that's what we talked about with a lot of our clients, is setting those expectations early on, because it is really hard when you get discharged from the hospital. You typically have gotten discharged from the hospital, even from an inpatient rehab facility, long before you would expect that your recovery would ever be complete. And in some cases, as we heard earlier from a personal testimony, it may even be long before you've actually even seen the full impact of what happened as a result of your injury. You're already home trying to figure out what's going on with this and what this is going to look like. And knowing where you fall can help set expectations in terms of what your long-term recovery is going to be like. Because you never want to rob anyone of hope, but you do want to be very honest with someone about the fact that if you've had a moderate to a severe traumatic brain injury, there's a very real likelihood that you're not talking about full recovery. You're talking about recovering to the highest level that you're going to be able to. And those are the tough conversations that we have with people following a brain injury, as we try and set expectations for what the next, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year in life is going to look like for the people that we serve.
So,
Go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, so, to kind of, like I said, I'm not sure if you're going to be going into this in the next few, and just be safe, Belinda, I'll be to the few next thing, but I've had a question. Someone sent me a question, and it says, how do we help others develop an understanding of their risk of getting TBI? Now, Scott and I also had that's a good question, great question. But also the question for me with that is, and I shared with Scott, I wanted to do my best to stay away from the war stories and the fear thing, right? Because we all know that doesn't work sometimes, right? Like, we can say all we want about people, doing that. But so that definitely is a discussion I want to have, Scott, if we have. Let's see, I've had a couple other questions. Let's see, what has been the most effective way to encourage individuals to actively prevent TBIs in our case? Good. That's another good question. So I had someone personally send it to me. Now Dr. Ray has put it in the chat box. And once again, I will share that I told Scott that I wanted to make sure that we did not go down the war story, because that can be very dangerous. But also wanted to stay away from the black lung, don't smoke kind of thing. So how can we encourage in a safe way without scaring our students? And like I said, this is so Tribe Talks, I was kind of explaining to Scott, is about a developmental tour where we want to be better rider coaches. That's why we're giving up our Wednesday nights, right? That's why we come and we support each other. And so, yeah, so if you would answer that.
Yeah, and I'll be honest with you, and I will address this a little bit more later on, but maybe not as much now, but I'm happy to answer the question. It's a difficult question to answer, because the reality of it is and this kind of goes back to what Belinda said and what she asked me about, and I get this question an awful lot. I mentioned that I get all the questions about sports. Whenever I do a TV interview or a radio interview, if I ever drop in the initial conversation with someone that I have a son, I have a 13-year-old son, and the first question they ask me is, are you going to let your son play football? And my answer is always, if he wants to, yes, because people are going to engage in behaviors that have risk. I'm not going to take some hardline position and say, no, you can't play football. No, you can't do this. No, you can't do that. Every time you get in a car, I've got two 20-year-old girls and a 13-year-old son. And when my girls started driving, it scared me to death because I was like, they're on the road now and I know what can happen when they're on the road. But I'm not going to tell them you don't get to have a license or you're not going to have a car, because a brain injury can occur if you get behind the wheel of a car. For me, so much of what we do is not trying to scare people from a prevention standpoint of saying, don't do this. It's to find what are the manageable, reasonable things that you can ask of someone to say, hey, I know that every daily activity carries a risk factor with it. What can you do to minimize the risk factors within that activity? And certainly, that comes back around. Don, the one thing he did ask me was, he said, make sure you talk about helmets. And so, that certainly is what we're going to come down to. We work a lot with Kohl's department store and the Kohl's Care Foundation and providing helmets to kids, especially for bicycle riders and skateboarders and others like that. We encourage helmets every way that we can. We even encourage helmets. We tell people, if you have a helmet, we spend so much time also reminding people to put your helmet on in severe weather situations, because anytime you can protect your head, where there could be something that hits your head, you're going to improve your chances of not having a traumatic brain injury. For us, and this comes into sort of the second lead-in question that we skipped over, is the fact that the bigger fear for me, and I guess where I probably put more of our attention, is not in trying to tell people, hey, traumatic brain injuries are real, you need to, and we do try to go through some of the statistics and we talk about the ways that they happen. We talk about some of the unusual ways that they happen. And if there are things that you can encourage someone to do to minimize that, absolutely we do that. But for me, we try to encourage people to know, how do you recognize it when something has happened? How do you recognize a brain injury when it's occurred? Because the scare, so they're not changing their behavior and put themselves at risk of getting a second brain injury. Because in terms of prevention, if you can prevent the first brain injury, it actually decreases your chances of having a second, third, or fourth, obviously, because it increases exponentially. Once you've had one brain injury, it becomes exponentially easier to have a second brain injury, because your brain is going to be more susceptible to having a second concussion after a first. It's going to be even easier to have a third concussion after a second. And once you start having the cumulative effects of multiple concussions, multiple brain injuries, or God forbid, the even worse situation is having a second concussion before you've recovered from the first, because it's not an additive property where the second concussion doubles the damage to the brain. Again, it's an exponential increase. If you have a second concussion before you've recovered from the first concussion, you're talking about serious long-term consequences to your brain that you can never recover from. So we really spend so much of our time trying to make sure that people recognize when a brain injury has occurred, to know that they need to pull back and be careful and give their brain time to heal, because ultimately every activity could lead to a brain injury, and you're never going to be able to have a solid prevention method to say, if you do this, this is going to happen. I think all the things that you would counsel someone to do when you're training them on how to ride is probably going to be things that are going to fall in with what you can do to prevent a brain injury, because you're teaching people to ride safely. And if you're doing that, that should lead to a reduced risk factor for what happens if you do get a brain injury. The bigger fear is going to be if someone falls, hits their head, and they ignore some of the signs and symptoms of what that brain injury is and believe they can continue going forward without taking the time to recover. That's where the real danger point, I think, comes in, that we would really like to focus on. So I didn't completely answer your question about how we would convince someone, because there aren't a lot of ways to convince someone to practice prevention, unfortunately, until you've had a scare or a near miss or something that kind of opens your eyes to what that danger truly is. Because most of us live in a world where you feel that you're invincible until you're not. And whatever that behavior is, whatever you're doing, you're not going to recognize it. Hearing from someone, and Belinda and I talked about this, I've got, I had a list of 9 clients that I thought that I could invite to come on to this call and tell their story. And there were just 9 that came off the top of my head and tell their story of how their brain injury occurred that changed their life forever while they were riding a motorcycle. Sometimes it's because somebody else struck them. Sometimes it's because they themselves were at fault. But I was also counseled that that's probably not the best way to do this in terms of doing that, because you guys understand that, and me bringing someone and telling their horror story of what happened isn't going to change what that looks like. And most of the one thing I will say for every one of those that came to mind, the one thing I would say about every one of them is that of the 7 who were able to, they went back to riding again.
And
And
so
that's-
Scott, I think that's where I would say would be part of what we would want to do, right? Is that we take our stories, and there's a difference in when, like I said, you hear me say that because that's a negative experience of like with others that only go to the negative, right? And so they forget to, when we talk about, we share our struggles, but we also have to share our healing stories too, right? So to share that part of it. So maybe that is also a way, you know, a good discussion of how do we have that discussion with our own students. Robin has the perfect first breakout session. I don't know if you can see the chat.
I'm pulling it up right now.
Yeah, and so Robin says, how do my fellow rider coaches or my fellow coaches inspire I guess curriculum driven discussion plus the safer choice without doom gloom, meaning strictly a positive learning environment. So how about we
I
take
like that a lot.
Yeah, how about we take our first quick breakout room, and you guys think how can we do that? How can we keep it positive with the understanding of how serious that this subject is, right? I mean, we know the statistics, hopefully we do. And by the way, Scott, I was going to ask before anyone else does, can we share these slides? May I email them to anyone that wants them?
Absolutely.
And yeah, and I can have Don put them on his website too, but I can email them to anybody that wants them if it's good with you.
Okay.
Good.
Absolutely.
All right. So how about this? We'll do a quick breakout. We'll say 10 because we figured out that's like the perfect time to get you guys talking, but not too much, not too short. And I will copy this in. So thinking with positivity, you guys answering that question, how can we put that question in there? Just make sure everybody can see it, and then I'll broadcast it into your rooms. These are completely random, by the way. I just went assign. So we will see who ends up where. It's into your life. Oh. Welcome back, everyone.
Yes.
Hope we didn't. Yeah. Thank you, guys. I hope you guys had a great discussion. All right. Everyone is coming back. Welcome back, everybody. All right. I hope I didn't see maybe we'll drop off. All right, we'll just kind of do some kind of go in order tonight. So I'll do a little bit of for the first one at least. So room 1, Bill, Kathy, Shu, what'd you guys come up with? What were some of the discussions you had?
Well, the discussion we had, and I think Shu gave us the solution, is talk about the positives of wearing the helmet by utilizing statistical information. So share with the students that people are more likely to survive, 60% are more likely to survive a crash with a helmet as opposed to the 40% that don't. And, you know, make it a fact-based, informed decision. That's what I came away. Shu, if you want to elaborate.
Yes, sure. And if you want the statistics, they're all on the Smarter website, smarter-usa.org. Among
Now
other.
I have a follow-up question for that. How many of your students think you are actually going to go to that?
Oh, 0. Absolutely none. But I'm in Massachusetts where they have to wear helmets.
So all I care is what they do in New Hampshire. Like when they cross the border over to New Hampshire, hi, John, to go see you, then I want them to keep their helmet on. And people from Massachusetts, they love statistics, they love science.
I have figured that out recently, last few days. Yes. So yeah. I will share that John and Shu and I were sitting and having ice cream last night, and we were literally sitting there watching people just go by and come in the parking lot, and we were like dumbfounded. So yes.
Come hang out at my dealership.
Yeah. And so yes, well, good. Well, how about group 2? We got Chuck, Elvin, or this is Mike, so I don't know which one you go by, and then Joe. Did you guys come up?
Yeah, so when we were talking, one of the things that we were trying to focus on was staying within the curriculum, and the curriculum kind of speaks for itself and has some great messages when it comes to the prevention of injury, not just in general, but trying to equate that with the TBI that's not really specifically mentioned in the curriculum. So just kind of letting the students have those discussions and help guide them into prevention versus like some of you said, the war stories.
So anybody on that room? All right, room 3, John, with 4-letter John and 3-letter John. And Lynn.
So we chatted about a couple of different things. There was the conversation about how the approach of this might vary a little bit between a helmet loss state and a non-helmet loss state. Or a minimal helmet loss state, I suppose we should say here. You still technically do have to have it if you're under 18, but
So a motorcycle hat.
Yes. We talked about the importance of positioning students so that they can make an informed decision and then letting them be adults and make their own conclusions from there. There's a discussion about that. There's a discussion about different places in the curriculum where that discussion could come up potentially, obviously in the pre-writing quiz, the ATGAT slide or poster, depending which version of the curriculum you're using. The Harley gear activity would be another option for those of us that are HDRA. And then I'll open the floor up to my other teammates to add color.
I have I guess some people would call it a war story. I have a story that I tell often, not every class, but semi-frequently, about a soldier on a military base near one of our sites that made a series of poor decisions. And it's kind of coming down to that, the decisions that we make have outcomes and we need to live with the outcomes. And this guy was, he was a couple of days away from taking his rider course for free on post, which he's supposed to do, per the regulations. But he didn't wait for that. And he went on a ride on a very high powered sport bike that he had probably no business being on as a new rider. And he wasn't wearing the protective gear that the military says he has to wear and common sense says to wear. And he rode in a manner that anybody would say was crazy, 100 and whatever miles an hour, zipping in and out of traffic. And he crashed and he lost an arm and a leg. And, the statistics show this, the studies show that riders make choices, and sometimes the choices they make, they know they're the wrong choices and they make them anyway. That was something that came out of the military sport bike, the foundation of that. And, just to get people to think about the decisions that you're making and that there's an outcome and that, sometimes that outcome, we can't walk it back and say, oh no, I didn't mean to do that. And we need to make good choices up front. And I don't particularly view the story as a doom and gloom sort of story. I mean, it has a sad note at the end, and I say, hey, this guy, he's got to live with this result and his family has to live with the result. And I bet every day he wishes he had made some different choices. So what's going to make you make the choices? And that kind of comes into the emotional section of the, yeah, right. Went out of my head, the emotional section of the writing subtasks. And just to kind of spur their thought process. So I think maybe there's a way to include a story without having it be doom and gloom exactly, but to kind of spur the conversation further. And even if they don't discuss it, to have them think like, wow, what I decide to do really matters. There's an outcome for everything I do has an outcome. It could be a good outcome or bad outcome. And I need to make good choices so that it's a good outcome.
So Lynn, you're the first one to say the word choices, right? And I think that's where the discussion kind of would go right now. It's about choices. And what is our choice? But yeah, and I said earlier with Scott, there's a difference in, we can share some experiences, but we also want to share the positives too at the same time, right? The healing, right? We share our struggles, we also share our healings. But yeah, so I like that you brought the word choice. So yeah, and Marie, I apologize. I forgot to say you were in that room also. All right, so thank you for that. Room 4, we have Paula, Ray, Rick, Robin, and Zach. I don't know how you guys ended up with 5 people in your room, but I do apologize. But yes, so who is going to speak for your room? What do you guys come up with? I promise you, Dr. Ray is not going to judge any of y'all. Don't worry. If you don't get starstruck, any of that, please.
42. We came up with 42.
42. There
Yes.
you go. I love it. Thank you. That's my favorite answer. But the question, Robin, do you have a towel? That's the question. But there you go.
I've got many towels.
There you go. All right. So what do you guys come up with?
I don't want to be the one to speak. I'm going to jumble this. Somebody who's feeling eloquent, do the work for me. Not Dr. Ray.
What do you guys?
Well, okay. We all remember the classroom stuff. So a lot of we were reminded about, okay, now we got to transition. How do we create the discussion on the range? And I was really happy when Dr. Ray brought up exercise 8, because it made me think myself. I didn't answer my own question. It wasn't something I knew the answer to. But like, if you're doing exercise 8, these are moments when you can, maybe during a break or while you're setting up, while they're standing around, one of the questions could lead them to discuss what decisions they might want to make. So the whole thing, somebody was mentioning how we can provide a yada every corner of coaching. Not that I'm great at it, but every corner of coaching is, can I be as lazy as possible? And can I get them to do the discussing? Can I get them to talk? So I can just put rubber on the ground, ride the stupid bike, come back, make sure they're going to be all right. Can I get them to be doing the work? So I guess, yeah, if I can't inspire them to start asking the questions among themselves or talking among themselves, then maybe I can try to insert something in that at least has a triggering effect. Maybe that was last Tribe Talks. I don't remember. Somebody tell me, what did we say?
No, and once again, you guys brought in the word choice, right? It's what I'm hearing you say. And FYI, Dr. Ray, I will say that your VRETs for exercise 8 is the most shared video VRETs that I share with people. So I'm glad that you brought that up, because it all talks about choices. So yeah. Anyone else from that group want to?
We also activity 10 was mentioned in the level 2 classroom portion, where we offer a subject and the students make that choice that Lynn was talking about, and talked about keeping it neutral, that they're thinking of the positives, why to do it and why not to do it, and ultimately that reason for doing it or not is personal, and they either write something down or they share it or not. So we brought up I think someone else discussed the poster, the Pools gear and the cool gear could spark a conversation also.
Yeah, reading your audience is big. Reading your audience and knowing how to get them to talk.
You can get the right personality in your class to to further that conversation about a helmet and why that person bought that helmet, and have it, have what are the features on it that you bought it for, and just let them run with it more or less.
Good.
I,
I
ha-
also-
I haven't heard this conversation in a long time, but back when I was a new rider, and the anti-helmet law crowd was maybe a little more vocal than they are nowadays. I remember people having the dialogue of I don't want to wear a helmet because I'd rather die than have a traumatic brain injury.
America is my helmet.
And I haven't heard that conversation actually in a really long while. Has anybody else been hearing that at all? Or is that a vestige of the past?
I don't know, Scott, that's a good question. Have you heard people say that? I mean, like, is that something that you hear?
Yeah,
I've heard that. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah, no, I still hear it, but that
Yeah.
could be indicative of where I live, right? Because it's not just the wild, wild west here. We got way more than that.
where are you?
Alaska.
Oh, okay.
I would think most people keep a bit of a mask on, considering they're taking a class, and if their ultimate goal, if they have that thought embedded in their head anyhow, well, I just want to get my paper, I want to get my license, and as long as I behave through the class and not bring up the idea that all I want to do is ride without a helmet, they're going to bury that till you're not involved in the conversation within earshot, or completely when they leave the class, they have that choice, and that's what they're committed to.
Oh yeah,
I think that-
I remind my students that, hey, guess what? I'll see you on bike night. And I will shame you. No, just kidding.
I think that also depends a little bit on the environment. I mean, it depends obviously a certain amount on the student, but it also depends a certain amount on the environment that you've created. Like I've had students before who were perfectly comfortable saying they don't plan on wearing a helmet, and we were able to have a very frank conversation about it. And I think it's to some extent, obviously, the comfort level of the student, but depending on how you set the environment up, they may feel comfortable or not comfortable with that.
Can I say something? I don't-
Go for it.
Too much of me.
Not
So,
throwing shade, just saying that could affect things.
Throw
Oh,
shade, man,
there's-
throw shade. No, just kidding.
A coach that shall remain nameless. I'm not going to say his name. I've watched him walk up to a person and say, "Well, then, do you insure your bike?" And they're like, "Yeah," and he's like, "Why? You're never going to crash. Why spend the extra money? You don't need it. What's the point?" And yeah,
That's interesting.
personal laughing moment.
Well, so Scott, what you got for us, man? We after hearing everybody's what stood out to you the most, and then like I said, then we can move on to the next quick topic. Yeah.
No, the only thing I would like to add to that, and I appreciate what everyone shared, and obviously I'm coming at it from a slightly different perspective because I am not currently doing what you do, but the other thing that I will say of all, and we work with right now 1,634 traumatic brain injury survivors in the state of Alabama. That is our caseload that we work with. And to me, all of them are tragic and it's a traumatic situation. But I think some of the saddest stories that I hear from the clients that we serve are the ones who were injured doing something that they love and weren't able to go back and do it again. And I do think that's a very compelling argument, because if you were, I mean, and it's awful, but if you were attacked by someone you didn't know, if you were shot, those are terrible situations and they're just as life altering. But when you have someone who loved doing something so much, were injured doing that thing and then can't go back and do it again, that is such a tragic outcome, because it's not just that they got robbed of some of their identity, they got robbed of what they love doing. And I think that does have an application on what we're talking about here, in terms of the fact that when you're making those decisions and you're talking to someone about the choices that you make, they're learning to do this for a reason, because they love the idea of being able to ride. And if they lose that because they make poor decisions, it's just such a worse outcome for our clients when we run into those people who are injured doing their passion. And that's something that struck me as you were talking. So I appreciate all of you sharing.
So, yeah, so what did you have for us next, Scott?
Yes, sorry.
Because
I know you're trying to
no,
move.
no, because this kind of leads into, I think this just leads into a little bit of the next one. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about how you can talk to people about what to even recognize in terms of what the signs of a traumatic brain injury are. Because something else I can tell you about very, very well is that even today, we have clients all the time who make the right decisions. They hit their head, they're feeling something, they're experiencing something, they go to the emergency department, and they are sent back home and told that they are okay when they weren't. And that is just a reality of the healthcare system. That happens today. That's not something that happened back in the 80s or in the 90s. That is still happening today. You know your body and you know your head better than anyone else ever will. And so monitoring these symptoms to find out if they resolve. So any of these things that you experience within the first 24 hours certainly would be a sign or indication that you've experienced a traumatic brain injury. If you have a headache that doesn't go away, if you don't have balance, if you have light sensitivity, if you can't focus, if you have slurred speech, if you have memory loss, progressive memory loss, dizziness, drowsiness, if you feel nauseated all the time, all of those are things that would lead you to believe that you have a brain injury. And if you go seek medical help and they send you home and you're still experiencing this, 24 hours, 48 hours, a week later, then you probably need to consider getting a second opinion, setting up an appointment with a neuropsychologist, something to actually confirm this diagnosis. Because again, if you're walking around and moving around and doing things and you have a traumatic brain injury and you're not aware that you have it, that is the greatest risk factor for long-term damage that you could ever do to yourself. And so those are the things to watch out for in terms of knowing what's going on. And I will send out, this is actually the back of a cut sheet that we send out to our clients. I have a couple of cut sheets that deal with traumatic brain injury that I will send to Belinda to share with this PowerPoint that she can share with you. They're quick front and back that really kind of summarize what's going on. But again, all of these tie back to where your brain is actually injured. And so again, when we were talking about the coup and the contra coup and going forward and backward and different parts of the brain being affected, there is not a good area of the brain to be damaged. It doesn't matter where the injury occurs. You can read through every one of these green boxes and there's something within there that you are not willing to sacrifice. And so when you start thinking about what this looks like, and it's everything from, from personality changes. We have so many clients that we serve whose marriages fall apart after their brain injury because they truly changed personalities and became a different person. And their spouse says, it's not that I don't love them anymore, I just don't know who they are. I don't know who they are anymore because they've changed so dramatically from what they were like. And so this is what you're risking in terms of the functions of the body that are impacted when you don't protect your brain. And again, you could challenge someone, find one of these and say, oh, I'm okay with this part of my brain being injured, with this lobe being injured. There isn't one, because every one of them has something. And obviously, the further down you move, when you get to the cerebellum or the spinal cord, you're getting into life support type issues, where if you injure those parts of your body, you're talking about like truly life or death type situations. But all of these can lead to an altered state cognitively, physically, both, that are going to impact you for the rest of your life. So this is just the back of a cut sheet that we share. So I'll send it to you so you can take a look at it to understand a little bit more about that. But
So Scott,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Belinda. Yes.
No, so to kind of piggyback a little bit off what you just said, it made me brought something to my heart was, so we have our statistics, right? And we share those. And then the other ones, a conversation that I was having with my fellow coaches yesterday was about the human aspect of this. So coming from my brain, my heart, and my therapist kind of mindset is like, when you say that, like, it's not just the physical aspect, right? Yes, your head, 65% of people, yes, okay, head injury, great. What about the ripple effects that happen afterwards, right? In your, like you said, in the marriage, different things like that. So I think also kind of being aware of statistically wise and being aware of, hey, how is this going to affect everything else in your life? I mean, I know I have many more people that track me on Life 360 since last October. I can promise you that if my motorcycle stops for more than 10 minutes and I don't text somebody, somebody's looking for me, right? So now I have affected someone else in my life. I have affected the others in my hula hoop because of my injury. I mean, because of my accident, right? So I think being aware of how that also not just affects this itself, but everything else around us. And so just help me be around. Like I said, that just kind of came to my mind whenever you said what you said. I was just like, okay, connecting the emotional aspect of it too, not just the physical.
Well, no, and thank you for sharing that, Belinda, because you're absolutely right. Because any one of these where you're not able to do it, it doesn't mean that it's not being done. It means that someone else is doing it for you. So you are giving up part of your freedom to someone else in your life who's going to have to perform that function for you. If you can no longer feed yourself, someone's going to feed you. If you can't remember things, something's going to have to remember for you. Every one of these functions that you give up when you allow a brain injury to occur is something that someone or something else in your life is going to end up having to do for you.
So yeah, so I guess that would be maybe a kind of a spin-off little thing to think about is for those people that say, well, I don't need to wear a helmet because I'm not going to survive it anyways, right? Or I would rather just, die than, have a traumatic brain injury, whatever, right? So I'm going to step in as the grief support person, right? And I'm going to say, well, then it means you really don't care about your family, kind of thing, right? Like I'm gonna tug on those emotions sometimes, right? And say, well, it's not all about you. So, so I think finding those gentle ways of reminding people that when we get on a motorcycle, when we we're making the choice for ourselves, yes, but we also have, we affect others. And
Okay.
that can be
When I give
Can
that
you-
story about the guy, I always say, hey, this guy, he lost an arm and a leg in his crash. And I like, here's a 22-year-old guy, he lost an arm and a leg. His life just changed forever. And his family's life just changed forever. Everybody connected with him in his circle has been affected by that. And the military said, hey, you know what? You just broke every rule we have on a you're done. So he lost his support group, that he would have had if he had been following regulations and stuff. Just one bad decision after another, and there's a ripple effect, like you say. I same thing. I do the little guilt thing a little bit.
So that's where
kind of gentle, but yeah,
so I want to challenge you, Belinda, on that, where
please do.
I don't want to challenge the message. I totally agree with the message. I get that. So my challenge for you right now on the fly for fun, all right, with the glass of WD for me to sip on right here is, can you right now come up with a question version of what you just said that brings their family into the mix, into the picture, so that they have to tie that together on their own, instead of you suggesting that they apparently don't care about their family?
Yes.
Is there a way to do that?
I would very simply, I would just reframe it as, what would that look like for your family? No shame, nothing, no shame, no guilt, no nothing involved. Just what would that look like for your family? And it's not why, it's not how, it's not that, it's just what would that look like? So yeah, so super simple. All right, kiss it, y'all. Keep it simple, sister. So yeah, so that's my answer for you. So yeah, how am I an entry? Yeah. Who would take care if you were hurt? So be aware of the guilt thing. So yeah, that's a whole nother that's a whole nother subject about chains and stuff. So yeah. But yeah, how would that affect?
Well, fatal vision goggles. If you lost your license, you got someone who's going to take you everywhere you need to go for the next 6 months because you're going to get your license suspended. How's that going to work for you?
And I think it's finding that gentle balance, right? Like I said, we want to make sure we keep all shame and guilt and those kind of things out, because that does lead down the rabbit holes of the not fun rabbit holes. And so, but we also want to have thought provoking. I love that, Robin. Thank you so much for challenging me. I appreciate you. And, yeah. All right. So what else we got for us, Scott? So we'll discuss, and then someone can throw out what we're going to discuss next.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring really CTE into the mix, because I think it's important to also remember that every time you hit your head doesn't mean you have a traumatic brain injury. But I know when Belinda and I first talked, something that I shared with her is the fact that the brain itself, in a lot of ways, is sort of like a Fitbit, any sort of something that tracks steps. That there are only a certain number of hits that every brain can tolerate. The frustrating part is that every brain is wired differently, and they're not all set to the same number of hits. But you don't know how many hits it's going to take to where the next one, even if it's just a mild hit to the head, not something that falls into the category of even a traumatic brain injury, but that may be the one that actually leads to long-term cognitive impairment, that leads to early onset to CTE, because most of the situation that they've identified with CTE is not due to multiple TBIs, it's due to just repeated blows to the head that fall far below the threshold of what would be considered a traumatic brain injury. And because you never know what that is, anything that you can do in your everyday life to minimize one or two of those hits is going to make things better. I'm guessing by the reaction, somebody put something in the chat that is interesting that I did not see.
Yes, please, guys. Oh my gosh, yeah, that's the best thing. Yeah, that.
The old owl asking to how many licks to the center of a Tootsie Roll. Yes, unfortunately, everyone's Tootsie Roll Pop is different. But that's an excellent example, an excellent way of phrasing that. So, and again, with CTE, you are talking about progressive brain disease. You are talking about cognitive deterioration that's going to affect every aspect of your quality of life. And so anything you can do to prevent those, why wouldn't you do that? The TBIs themselves are serious enough. So the first couple of bullet points are actually centered around that, in terms of the fact that if you have had one TBI and you have a second, it's going to take you longer to fully recover. The symptoms are actually going to be more severe. And every time it's going to lead to a greater likelihood of long-term complications, whether it be, headaches or physical problems, memory, concentration, anything that goes along with that. And it's fascinating. I do a lot of trainings with law enforcement right now because a lot of our clients have tense interactions with law enforcement, because law enforcement will encounter them, not recognize that their behavior is not due to intoxication, is actually due to a TBI. Because a lot of times they present the same way. And when I do these, what's fascinating is I'm trying to educate law enforcement on how to recognize traumatic brain injury. And what most of them come up and talk to me about afterwards is the fact that they've had 4 or 5 concussions due to their service through law enforcement, and they're worried that some of the things that they're seeing in themselves now in their late 40s, early 50s, even late 50s are signs of the progressive impact of multiple TBIs. They're talking about having had 3 to 4 situations where they've lost consciousness, and now they're searching for words. Or sometimes when they're driving home, they'll come back into their driveway and not remember driving home. And they're seeing things that are happening that a lot of times you would never even associate with being a possible long-term cognitive impact of a traumatic brain injury, but it is. And so then you really need to start thinking about what can you do to try and really monitor that to make sure that it doesn't get worse, because you've already seen that there are long-term consequences and anything you can do to prevent that long-term. But I do think it's important to remind people any blow to the head is not good. It doesn't matter if it's a traumatic brain injury or if it's just a blow to the head, they all have a cumulative effect of what's going on. And ultimately, and we've talked about this a lot, the only thing that you can do about that is to wear a helmet. And I think that one of the things that we would love to be able to try to do, and Belinda and I talked about this a little while ago during the breakout room sessions, is really to work hard to create a culture where it's okay to wear a helmet starting as a kid. I see so many people riding skateboards. I see so many people, riding tricycles and bicycles that aren't wearing helmets. And I think it does make it easier as you go through life. If you don't start off with that culture of riding a helmet when you're young, it doesn't feel as natural when you get older. And the more that we can do to create that culture that you wear a helmet when you're riding something, whatever that looks like, that's a real positive that we can put together. Again, the CDC, you guys have reported on it, but specifically to head injury, unhelmeted riders are 2 times as likely to be hospitalized for a head injury as someone who is wearing a helmet, and it reduces the risk of head injuries by almost 70%. So all the arguments for why you wouldn't wear a helmet really fall apart, because it does save lives. but also it saves people's lives from being adversely impacted due to head injury. It's not just saving someone from living or dying in the accident, it also saves your quality of life by allowing you to survive something that you might not would have otherwise survived, but also to not have the long-term consequences that someone who's not helmeted would have. So we're all about, from a prevention standpoint, we are all about encouraging helmet use in every situation where you can protect your head, because you only have a certain number of hits that it can take, and anything that you can do to stop adding to that total is going to be a plus. We're seeing it in so many aspects of life. You see it with football now, where they don't do a lot of contact practice anymore because they figured out the same thing. They read the science and they said the human brain can only take a certain number of hits. We're not going to waste hits on your brain in a football practice over the summer because we know we've only got a certain number of them out there. We're going to save them for when it's actually game time. So save the hits to your head for when you can't prevent them, and do everything you can to prevent the ones you can. And that would probably be my closing message for anything that I would say before we go into some final discussion, is this, that it all comes down to helmets to make sure that we don't go down that road.
Yeah, and so I will see, I'm gonna take a stretch here, and I'm going to ask that in your breakout rooms, I want you to think back. So I will share very openly that after Scott and I spoke, like I said, we spoke for almost 2 hours the first time. That statement right there, your brain only has so many resets, pretty much, right? Like, and before it just goes, fine, if you're not going to take care of me, I'm just done, right? And so I literally stopped for, and I was like, I went back and started counting, trying to remember all of the times in my head, right? Like I was like in my head, speak, like, how many times have I been hit in the head? How many times have I done that? I mean, 98, I hit, young 18-year-old decide not to wear a seatbelt. I hit the head, I hit my head on the windshield. But even before that. And so that led into this also discussion of like that early prevention, right? Even when they're riding tricycles, they are not allowed to be on their tricycle unless they have a helmet on. So the early prevention. So I would like for you to do something a little different than what I kind of started with, was avoiding the war stories. I'm going to break you up in your breakout rooms, and I want you to think about how many times have you been bonked in the head? Like, go back and think about it and share that in your group. Like, how many times have I been like, oh, and just like I said, just see if you can remember, just see if you can figure that out. Have a fun discussion and then come back and let's talk about that for a second. Okay.
Belinda, I would say if you can't remember, it's probably a sign it's more times than what you think.
That's good. Maybe. So, Ray, I see you unmuted yourself.
No, I just getting ready for the chat room.
He's like, yes, he's like counting up already on his fingers. Hey, and if you have to take your shoes off to count, y'all, because that's how many you have to get past your fingers, I'm telling you. All right, I'm gonna think you guys take a few. All right, have fun. Love that. All right, guys. So, any really great war stories or anything? Actually, you know what? I'm gonna call him out. Dr. Ray, what's your best? How many times have you been knocked on the noggin?
I shared twice, one when I was 7 years old, playing war with the kids my age, and I got hit by a dirt clod, but I think there was a rock in the middle of it, and it dazed me I just remember it was hard to stand up for a few seconds. I just wanted to go to the ground like I'd been hit. And one other time, it was an office incident where I was reaching for something and my chair went out from under me, and the backrest hit the back of my head. And I remember being dazed, being coherent, that I was dazed, but kind of that moment of being frozen. Both those were rather mild compared to what we're talking about here. Those are the only two incidents I can think of, but now I can forever use those as why I'm the way I am now.
Yeah, I think everyone, you said the word dirt clog, everybody that lives anywhere that did that was like, I think the trauma came back to them just instantly, right? Like that rock that we think is just a big thing of dirt. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. Anybody else have any like good bonk stories that they would like to share? Like any spectacular times they got knocked on the noggin?
I whacked my head really hard when I was maybe 20 something. I was on a ski trip and I had just advanced from the bunny slope to the big hill. And it was a very, very cold day, and the conditions were kind of icy. And I am not like Joe Skier or anything. And I had a little thing where my feet went out from under me and my head smacked down hard on a very icy, hard, ski slope. And, I kind of got my bell rang, as we discussed for a little bit. And, I laid low for a day after that. I didn't seek treatment, but, I kind of tried to little self-care there, but I was young and stupid, who knew? And now years go by and I had a series of sinus infections that weren't getting better. And so my doctor gave up on me and sent me to the ENT, who ordered a CAT scan. And the CAT scan showed that my sinuses were okay. But in the CAT scan, they discovered I have a brain tumor. And it's right at that place where I smacked my head. And, they don't know what causes it. And it's benign and it's just there. And, I have to go for an MRI every couple of years. And so far, nothing has come of it. But they said it could come from an injury, like if you smack your head really hard. And so there you go. I have no way to know if that's where that came from or not, but maybe. So now I got a thing I got to look after. They say it's not cancerous, but it could grow and kind of get in the way. So we kind of have to monitor that.
Interesting. Paul, it's good to hear on you. Do you have a good bump story for us?
What is the treatment, Scott? What is the treatment that you go to? You indicated that the hospitals don't diagnose it correctly. Lynn just talked about she laid low. So you think you have a TBI? What is the treatment? What do you do? What is the correct doctor to go see, or those kind of things?
If you think that you've had a concussion, you're presenting through the emergency department. That if it's more moderate than just very, very mild. If it's mild, more than likely they're going to prescribe that you get rest, that you not use devices, that you not stimulate your eyes, you stay in kind of a darker place until the symptoms start to subside. So it's always just going to be something along those lines of trying to minimize stimuli. They're going to tell you not to drive. The weird part about it right now is, like, especially for kids, if you're concussed as a child, maybe a 17-year-old, and you get a concussion, they will pull you out of sports, to pull you out of school, but they will not take your license away from it. You can still drive. And that is true in every state right now. There is not a state in the US that actually will take your driving privileges until you are cleared to go back to school or to go back to work. And so minimizing stimuli is what they're always going to say for that. For a more moderate to severe, then you're getting into actually wanting to stay under the care of a neurologist, get a neuropsychological exam. And in those cases, they're probably going to recommend that you get occupational therapy and speech therapy to make sure that you take the necessary steps to try and help the brain, as Murray talked about at the very, very beginning, to rewire itself to accommodate for whatever those long-term pieces are. Because there are things you can do to promote that, but the brain is only going to heal for about the first 3 to 6 months following the injury. So if you miss it and you're not doing the things you need to do to help it, once you reach that 6-month threshold, you're really plateaued in terms of the brain recovery. And then everything else after that is an accommodation, not something to promote recovery. And so that's why correctly identifying is so important, because you have a really narrow window where you can really kind of get the brain to work itself out versus trying to then have to come up with workarounds for things that'll be with you forever.
And Bill, there is some really great research on like stroke patients with the neuroplasticity work, like the brain literally heal, starting, but it's very slow. So if you're interested in anything like that, look up information and some research on that. And so how the brain can start, but it's a very slow process. So yeah, so I love that Scott said that, because that was one of the questions I asked him was, how do you treat a TBI? How do you do that? And when he said it's early, so we start with prevention. If we can't prevent it, we do early, make sure we're on top of it. And so that we can get that early work done. And then if we miss it, do our best to stay on top of just how to stay at a good level, I guess, right? And so, and then once again, I'm always gonna, I'm gonna like I said, how I got connected with Scott was I have a really great colleague that is an amazing therapist, and she works with the people and you know, with their people that have had, you know, brain injuries and also their families. So seeking not only physical, but also emotional and mental, you know, care along the way for if you do have it. So, yeah. And I know, and Scott, I'm assuming that's okay for me to share your information with everybody along with the PowerPoints and.
Absolutely, yes. And the only other thing I would ask, because it's sort of my PSA, so I have to do this, Belinda, I apologize, but whatever state you're in, there is going to be a state brain injury organization that is like mine within your state. Every state that I've heard represented has one. If you encounter someone and hear someone that's had a story, make that recommendation, because chances are the family, when you have a severe injury that takes place in the families in the hospital and everything else, someone's going to mention long-term supports, and no one wants to hear that, because you don't want to think that it's going to be a long-term recovery. You want to think that your loved one's going to get better before they come home, and it's not until 3 months later, when all the insurance provided therapy is done, when no one's calling and bringing you meals anymore, that's when the family really is like, what do we do now? That's where an organization like mine comes into play. We provide free respite care to caregivers. We have support groups for caregivers, for our clients. We provide free mental health counseling services. We provide free therapy services. We support people for life. We have people that have been our clients from 1984 until now, because their situation doesn't change. Traumatic brain injury doesn't get better. I actually got called out by somebody because our mission statement says that we support survivors of traumatic brain injury, and they said no one survives a traumatic brain injury. You survive the injury that causes the brain injury. You live with the traumatic brain injury. You survive the accident, you live with the traumatic brain injury. And it made sense to me. We didn't go back and change our mission statement, but it did make sense to me why they said that. And so if you encounter someone, make that referral to them and say, hey, look it up online, just type in, you know, brain injury Idaho, brain injury California, whatever it is, and you will find that agency, and they can help them find supports to make sure that whatever modifications or accommodations they need in life, they'll have. And yes, thank you, Belinda. That is how you can get in touch with me. So if you ever need resources or anything regarding that, we do in-services a lot, so we can also talk to someone just about how to recognize brain injury, whatever. So just let me know. Happy to help in any way.
So any final question, any feedback? As I stole this from a professor of mine, we got comments, feedback, snide remarks.
I
Wait till I
think just
log
a big
off for the
thank you.
snide remarks.
A big thank you to Scott for joining us for 2 hours out of his time to educate us. This was fascinating. And Belinda, thanks for putting it together. This is wonderful.
Yeah, this was an
I
amazing.
thought the graphic of the brain injury symptoms was awesome. With the
Yeah, and like
really
I said,
well done.
yeah, you guys, I said I will send them, like I said, I've gotten a couple people with sending me their email address, and I'm saving the chat. You can send them to me here, or like I said, make sure definitely that Dawn has the PowerPoint, and then those Scott's gonna send me, so Scott will send me that and the handouts thing that you had.
Yep.
And I'll make sure that he has those posted, and I'll make sure to get them to Dawn also, so he can share them with you by email. Scott, I'm so appreciative of you. So anyone else, anything else you guys, like I said, we're right at 8. I want to respect your time, but also I've got to, I'm on vacation now.
Real quick, when Scott mentioned one organization like his in every state, the state of New Jersey several years in a row had a collaboration with the state motorcycle program and the state highway safety office, and the Brain Injury Alliance, I think they call it in New Jersey. They actually sponsored some RRETs in the state. They had a funding source, and they pooled their resources, and it worked nicely for both the awareness, the Brain Injury Foundation, as well as, of course, the RiderCoaches getting to have a good professional development session. So there may be some good connections there too.
Thank you.
That's the link I just dropped into the chat. So there you go.
Beautiful. Thank y'all so much. Like, this really is, and like I said, this is definitely one of the most important subjects I think that we have as rider coaches. Robin, thank you for challenging me on different, how do we keep it positive and stay in statistics. How do we help every kind of learning style there is, right? Like, how do we touch on every part of it, physical, emotional, mental, of helping our students and helping our fellow rider coaches, right? Because there are those of us out there that we, the integrity kind of thing. How do we stay within our own, doing it ourselves and modeling that? So keep challenging yourself. So anything else, like I said, we're here. Feel free to scooch if you need to, but thank you guys so much for tonight.